Hi, I'm with Seba today. Hi, Seba, welcome. Where are you joining us from?
Hi, Pavi. Thank you for having me. I'm joining you all the way from South Africa. It's an honor for me to be here today. Thank you for the invite.
No, thank you so much for your time. I'm excited to chat with you. And would you like to start off by giving an introduction of yourself?
Oh my goodness, okay, I'll try. So I'm Sebabatso Mtimkulu. Everyone calls me Seba. I am first and most importantly a mom to two beautiful kids. I have a beautiful 6-year-old little girl and a 1-year-old little boy. I'm also a wife to a very wonderful gentleman by the name of Mtimkulu. He's my greatest cheerleader. So that is quite an important role for me in my life to being a mom to them. And on the professional side, I currently head up what we call group design operations at a bank here in South Africa. It's called Stanlib. The role entails looking after design operations across all the countries where the bank has a presence. So that's about 18 to 20 regions. So you can imagine how my day looks like typically. It's very crazy. I've been a practitioner in experience design for quite a while, specifically in this industry for the last 13 years or so. And I also have a small design consultancy called Joy to Use. So I'm really just passionate around how the design discipline is doing in South Africa. And with my role now, that has extended towards the broader African continent, building capabilities where the bank has a presence in those countries, but most importantly, building and creating more designers across the continent. And for me, that's quite an interesting journey that lies ahead. I'm very passionate about creating safe spaces for design practitioners to work in. And I'm very fortunate that my role right now at the bank has a culture formation aspect to it where we're able to set the tone around what kind of environment we want to operate in, what that atmosphere is like, and how our teams need to show up. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that lovely intro. And can I just say, I really appreciate that you started off with yourself as a mother and as a wife.
Yeah.
I often hear
Mm-hmm.
intros and it always starts off with job first, and
Yeah.
I think it's amazing that you started off with family.
Absolutely. It's my most demanding job. They are the boss of me. So it's always them first. And when they are happy and I know everything is taken care of on that side of things, I'm able to do my job properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. And can you tell me a little bit about how you got your first design job? Had to walk down memory lane.
Oh my goodness. I bumped into it. And I think for most people who've been in the space for as long as I have been, that is pretty much the narrative that I walked into something, I thought I understood what it was, but not really. So I had actually been working before I got into design specifically. I had been working for a small management consultancy for about 2 years or so. An aspect of the role that I was doing, in hindsight, actually incorporated design. So we were based at a government client and we were building a knowledge sharing platform for them. And my role in that space was to make sure that it's easy to use and we're training up all the area PAs that were meant to use the systems. I knew that this thing, it's meant to work in a certain way, it's meant to be as efficient as possible, but there wasn't any vocabulary for it. There wasn't necessarily a specific field for this thing. And it's only in 2008 when I joined a digital agency. It was called Aqua Online. It has since morphed into a couple of things. The business was bought and it's now become a completely different agency. There were clients and we're doing creative work that this role started being defined for me. And even then, there were a couple of iterations around what we actually called it. I remember going on board and it was called a usability analyst. And our role was to make sure that whatever creative went out to client was as usable as possible. But in hindsight, a lot of the journey to this point has been self taught. Of course, with exposure from that role that wasn't necessarily defined. I think in the South African context, particularly at that point in time, it was just starting out, people trying to get, a feel of this thing. What is the purpose? Why is it important? And really getting into it, having some form of structure around it, building a vocabulary around it, seeing what the industry around us is doing, that I think I was able to continue with it and formalize it as my career. So That's how I came across it. It was at a digital agency. I think it was a digital agency that was very progressive. They knew they had to offer their clients a little bit more. And they had defined this role called a usability analyst. And that was my first instance into design.
Wow, I think it's really interesting how things morphed and changed into more of a UX. And I think that makes sense because UX is still growing and I still feel like it's new. So it's really interesting how you took that path with your first job. What were some of the challenges you faced as like a first graduate and then getting into your first job?
If I think back, things that have, of course, changed right now, and I see it even at the bank and all the educational institutions that we liaise with. The challenge was that design was not a degree, it was not a qualification. You could not go to a university and learn about interaction design or learn about experience design or service design or even design thinking at a broader sense. So a lot of what you were applying on your role, a lot of the expertise that you're bringing on the table, particularly because I was at a digital agency, I was essentially a consultant being put on the client side of things, and I was meant to give input or recommendations on how client would structure their digital interactions. A lot of that was a lot of reading, a lot of self-referencing on what is happening in the world around us. At that particular point in time in South Africa, the field was relatively new. So it was only a handful of companies that did it. We didn't have a large community where you could have things like meetups or even have some form of a mentor. So I think just initially the confidence you had in the craft around, am I actually recommending the right things? Or is it what I'm putting together to this client or this project actually being executed in the right way? I would say that was my main challenge, but I was also very fortunate at that particular point in time to have quite a good boss. He was very strong. He played quite a big of a mentorship role and essentially planted a lot of the seeds and gave that sense of assurance and affirmation to say, yes, you are on the right track and this is how it is done. Because you didn't have a lot of people in which you could reference your thoughts, reference your solutions from.
Yeah, I think that's like a huge challenge, especially with a field that was so new at that time. And you spoke about the biggest challenge being confidence in the craft. So, what were some things that you did or you had to do to help you build up that confidence?
Oh my goodness, Pavi. It's practice, right? It's doing it over and over and over again. And I think what's so important to take note of, particularly as you're entering the field, that you really need to be open for feedback. I mentioned my boss earlier on. His name was Gary Greenfield. We're actually still in touch. I'm very close friends with his wife still. But if there was one thing that he did very well was give us that feedback. And I know sometimes as designers, we have a tendency of be very attached to our work. I think it's just a natural part of the kind of work that we do and everything that we put in it, is that sometimes when you do receive that feedback, it stings. I think that's just a natural side of things. But it's so important that you go in knowing that design is a doing word, right? You have to get your hands dirty. You have to experiment. You have to try concepts and be able to receive feedback. And the spirit in which you receive that feedback is very important. And I found that as soon as I switched a positive outlook towards that feedback and saying, okay, I'm receiving this, perhaps I missed the point here and there, 100% I'm going to take it back, I'm going to iterate. And doing that over and over again over the years, you find that your confidence actually boosts up. So being able to receive that feedback, but also being able to read and researching a lot. I think today there are so many resources in which you can do that from. So many websites. There are a lot of people on social media that you can start following. There are a lot of more smaller communities and meetups taking place that really knowledge is everywhere. It's so important to tap into that knowledge source, but just walk in the spirit of saying, listen, this is my time to absorb as much as possible. I'm going to learn as much as possible. And therefore, I'm fully open to feedback.
Yeah, you touched on some really great and important points there, which is feedback and
Yeah.
iteration, which are two things that we do from day to day in our design process. And I think you actually had to apply that to the way you learned and gain knowledge and gain confidence in the field. So I think that's quite amazing that you had someone that was giving you that feedback. And I think that really helped build up that muscle, which is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
What were some learnings that you had during this time as you were trying to build confidence? What were some of the potential quote unquote downfalls and things that you learned from?
That it's okay to be vulnerable. I'm thinking back at that point in time, I was at a digital agency. I was essentially a consultant. So by you being a consultant, it means client is paying for your time. Client is paying for your expertise. So you freely and openly put up your hand and say, I don't know. Hold on, I actually need some time to go figure it out. But I think organizations and just the culture in which we operate now has evolved a little bit more. And it's so important to show that vulnerability, that you don't necessarily have it all figured out, that I hear what you're saying, but I'm not able to give you a response right now. I need to do a little bit of research to get my head around it so that I can come back and give you an informed answer. And I think as soon as you start opening yourself up in that way, and people perceiving you not to be perfect, but as someone who really wants to show up and do the best in your role, and if it means taking a step back and going and finding out a little bit more and coming back to the table when you're a lot more confident, you'd find that when you show up in that way, it's actually well received in the audience around you. And that is something that we're not used to doing because we are expected to know right up front. But looking back, really the ability to say, okay, I actually don't understand something and I would like to just take a step back to go figure it out for myself, and being able to voice that to those around you, that is a very important part of that learning curve.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because I feel like a lot of folks who are listening would resonate with this, because one of the things I've seen is that even now, as fresh graduates are trying to apply and get their first jobs in design, one of the biggest fears they have is putting themselves out there and being vulnerable, because a lot of these job descriptions and opportunities that are out there are asking for an entire list of things, and some
Yeah.
you're not going to know everything, just as you
No,
said.
absolutely. And it's okay to voice it. I don't know. I don't know, but I do want to know. And if you give me some time to go research a little bit more about it, I promise you I will come back with a good solution. So the ability for that vulnerability is very important. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the environment around us enables someone to freely say it.
That is a great point with environment, because I think that can be really intimidating and frightening when you're not really sure what the environment would be like. A
Yeah.
great example of that is when you're doing interviews, you usually might not get the feel right away of what the environment would be like until you actually start to work. What sort of things have you seen or maybe implemented to help build up that environment?
Yeah, yeah. But at the bank, I had mentioned earlier on that it incorporates a culture aspect around what are the principles, what are the attitudes and the mindsets that we would like our teams to operate in. And quite a lot of those have to do with your line manager, with your boss, quite frankly. So I think it's so important that creating a safe space is not left to everyone assuming that it will just happen by magic, that it will just happen naturally. It's so important that we are deliberate in defining the kind of environment we want to have. And that's why your big organizations like your Netflix are very deliberate in terms of sharing what their culture principles are around collaboration and diversity in teams, making people feel safe to disagree, not ever making someone feel stupid for asking a simple question. Those are the kind of things that I believe, particularly as people that are now in design leadership, that are now looking after teams, that are now in positions where they're able to define that. I truly believe that you cannot take for granted that kind of environment will just happen. It needs to be very deliberate in defining how is it that you want to show up here in this workplace. And I guess also holding yourself accountable that you are showing up in that way. So when someone perhaps feels like they were mistreated or they didn't feel safe in a particular meeting, or they felt intimidated somehow during a design critique or whatever, giving permission to also voice that and give feedback and going back to that environment and correcting those things. I think over time that's really instilling a type of, this is how we work here. So it's really in those principles, in those attitudes, and that mindset that you need to agree on as a team. Perhaps not just one person, it's a group of people. Perhaps sometimes you even define it with the rest of your design community to say, how do you want to show up here? And even incorporating things like, we want our work to be fun. We want to incorporate a work-life balance. You need to define those things. You need to put them up on the wall. And now we're working from home, but you still need to print it out and put it up on a wall, just so that you know what is defining your overall culture practice. Otherwise, if we leave it undefined, that's where all of these things start creeping in, because we don't have a reference point.
Exactly. I think building up like a safe environment for your team is so important. And I agree, it needs to be intentional, it needs to be defined. And how it comes up from leadership, like what you mentioned about accountability and ownership, is definitely more than just the lead. I feel like often that entire responsibility just falls on the lead, but even you as a team member, and some, I'm sure you could speak from experience too, that you can also create that impact and call for change without having the responsibilities of a lead. So just taking that
Absolutely.
leadership role yourself. Yeah.
100%. 100%. Everyone is a leader.
Yeah.
In your own little space, you might not have a design lead or a design director title, but you looking after that piece of work and you meeting with those users and putting together that user schedule and your user interviews and scheduling your Zoom session to do user tests, you're actually taking leadership and ownership for that piece of work. So you are a leader in that right. So it's really a collective sport, regardless of title. Everyone is responsible for defining what kind of environment you want to show up in.
Exactly. So I want to shift gears a little bit. And now that you're a lead and you've been through your own journey, I'm curious to know what you're seeing right now in potential candidates and people who are fresh graduates or who are trying to get into design. What sort of things are you seeing and noticing?
Yeah, yeah. I think from a South African perspective, a lot has changed. I would say over the last 7, 8 years, we've had a lot of design schools coming up. Maybe let me not say a lot, but we have a few now that are offering full-on design degrees. So if we are looking at the hiring process, universities or guys that are straight from varsity that are maybe coming onto a graduate program, a lot of them come in with prior knowledge. So it's not necessarily starting from scratch anymore, which from me is a step in the right direction, because it means when you do get into your role and you start acquiring the formal, on the job exposure, you've had a good 3, 4 years background where you've maybe immersed yourself in some of the theory, immersed yourself in some of the principles. We acknowledge that you might not have necessarily experienced all of them, but you're coming in with the knowledge of what is it that you're going to do. Whereas that wasn't the case a couple of years ago. You would go into this thing, perhaps you were coming from a development background, you knew what design was, and you're going in and you're hoping for the best. But what we're seeing is that there definitely is a prior knowledge from the candidates that are coming from, a varsity perspective, which means that design as a formal qualification, as a formal degree, is starting to be a career choice. It's starting to be an option that most people leaving high school are now considering, which is really amazing. I look after a team of 19 graduates right now. They're actually on a year-long training program. It ends in September and they're going to come back and be integrated in the teams. But just the sense of confidence, the self-assurance, speaking your mind, to be honest, it still makes me nervous, but I just think it's the younger crowd. That's just how they are. They speak their mind, exactly what is it that they're feeling. And I honestly think that it's refreshing, that those are the types of qualities you need for someone to come in the team, to be able to hold a conversation with a stakeholder, be able to support and explain what is it that they're doing without any fear of, oh my goodness, can I start voicing? Can I start speaking a certain way? I'm very happy with how things are moving in this space, particularly from a higher education learning, that there is exposure to this field, and the guys that are coming through are a lot more equipped and knowledgeable in that space. We are, however, having another view of candidates that are transitioning into design. So this would be someone who maybe didn't start their career out in design, but they have shown a certain level of interest, and they even have a certain type of intrinsic motivation or a certain type of competence, and they're now coming into design. And that is where you start looking for the qualities of, is this person able to problem solve? Do they have emotional intelligence to have a difficult meeting with the stakeholder? So on the one hand, the guys that are coming from university fully versed into what design is about, but the guys that are transitioning into that space, there's still a little bit of education that needs to take place in terms of understanding what this field is about. But what I'm seeing is that a lot of people are actually signing up for personal boot camps. So a 6-week course on what design is. So I might not necessarily have a degree, but I will sign up for that 13-week course or that 10-week course just for me to get my head around the space. And then they would officially kickstart looking into taking their careers in that way. So that is what I'm seeing mostly right now in the market, from people that are coming straight in from universities or others that are already professionals that want to transition into the space.
That's amazing and a great load of information. I myself took a bootcamp course a couple years ago. So it was a couple months. Yeah, it was a couple months, and it was a full-time course, I think like 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. I met a lot of great people, but I think the harder part was actually afterwards. That is the most important part that is gonna either make things or break things, is actually what you do. I think you spoke about needing more experience and more learning after the course. That is the most important time, from finishing the course and then getting into your first job where you can do that. So the ownership and accountability is on that person to learn and to build up their skills during that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Seba. And I wanted to end off with asking, if you had a piece of advice that you'd like folks to take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
Sure. I guess that piece of advice would be for both people that are starting out, but maybe also those that have been in the field for a couple of years. And that would be, do not be afraid to do your time. What I'm picking up, particularly in South Africa, where the skill is still maturing. So we're not fully at the level where, some other countries are or some other organizations are, is that because of the lack of skill, when design leadership positions, for instance, open up, you have a lot of people applying, and of course that's where everyone wants to be. But that thing that you see on the job post that says 10 years of experience or that says 8 years of experience, or whatever that is, that's there for a reason. It's not meant to be there to be a gate to keep you out, but it's because over a certain amount of years, as you do your time, there are certain things that mature, there are certain things that develop that you're able to easily use later on in life. And if you are too quick to move over that period, I think that ends up having some negative ramifications in yourself, in your craft. And I guess it just overall jeopardizes the integrity of taking in all the knowledge you can, growing your craft, and really doing your time. And if your goal is looking after people or managing a team or heading up a division or whatever that is, the time for that will come. I think we're so fortunate right now that there's such a large community. And I think COVID and working from home has really made the world smaller. I'm speaking to you, you're the other side of the world. You're 7, 8 hours behind me. So you just starting your day, I'm finishing off my day, but we could easily be able to have a connect session and we can share input and mentor and coach or whatever it is that you'd like to call it. But in more and more organizations, we're really giving designers that are coming in the craft an opportunity to learn. I spoke to you about my graduates that are doing a year-long training program. That's the bank saying, for a year, just do nothing but learn. That is an amazing opportunity that I wish I had that when I first started out. So I would really say, when you're in the craft, it really is a doing craft. It's a craft where you need to experience things over and over again to enable you to reach whatever path that you wish to reach. and don't take shortcuts in that, just to ensure that holistically you're well rounded off and are able to show up in a way that you're supposed to in future.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. And again, thank you for your time. This was such a great conversation. And I'll make sure I'll share ways that people can connect with you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pavi.